Up next is the Evil God Challenge. So, we've got two different hypotheses on the table. One hypothesis is that there's an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God. And on the other hand, we've got a different hypothesis, which is that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, maximally evil God. And the Evil God Challenge is basically saying something along, there are different ways to put it. But one way to run the Evil God Challenge is to say that, well, hey, the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis are roughly equally plausible, or roughly equally likely, or roughly equally reasonable. After all, so the thought goes, arguments for a good God can often be paralleled to create roughly equally compelling arguments for an evil God. And famously, lots of arguments for God's existence don't tell us about the moral character of the creator or the designer or whatever. And moreover, objections to the existence of an evil God, for instance, that there's so much good in the world, can often be paralleled to create roughly equally compelling objections to the existence of a good God, that there's all this evil in the world. So the thought then is that the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis are roughly equally likely. The motivations for the good God hypothesis seem to carry over roughly equally plausibly to the evil God hypothesis, and the objections to the evil God hypothesis seem to carry over roughly equally plausibly to be objections to the good God hypothesis. And so, since they're both roughly equally plausible, or equally likely, or equally reasonable, if the evil God hypothesis is incredibly unlikely, then it's going to follow that the good God hypothesis is also incredibly unlikely. And so then the next premise is that, well, hey, the evil God hypothesis is indeed pretty unlikely. It just seems kind of silly in itself. Some people call it even preposterous. And moreover, the profound goods that we see in the world just seem to count strongly against its existence. And so then it follows that a good God is also incredibly unlikely to exist. That is the argument.
Now, I see this kind of as, I mean, it's obviously connected to the problem of evil. It might kind of be a support of the problem of evil. It might like be a version of it, because what we're essentially saying is like, consider, Mr. Theist, that there is this evil God. And the theist goes, well, I don't believe in that evil God that you're speaking of. And you're like, yeah, but like think of the Kalam cosmological argument, think of like all this kind of stuff. Like, surely God exists. Yeah, but you're saying he's evil and that kind of being can't exist. Why not? Well, look at all of the good in the world. If there was a perfectly evil God, why would like, surely the universe could be so much more evil. Like, obviously there's too much good in the world for there to be a perfectly evil God. And then the atheist says, aha, well, what about your good God? There's too much evil in the world for there to be a good God. Now, the interesting thing for me about this is that when you raise the problem of evil and say there's too much evil in the world for a good God, it doesn't end there, because the theist says, oh, but there are lots of reasons why God would allow so much evil. There are so-called theodicies. You can also construct these for the reverse case, right? So now I'm saying, what about this evil God? And a theist says, I don't believe in an evil God. There's too much good in the world. And I say, but my evil God has really good reasons to allow so much good. For example, what's something worse than a homeless person starving on the street? A homeless person starving on the street outside a banquet where people are like, just overly enjoying themselves, an abundance of food, so much food that half of it gets wasted and thrown in the bin, getting drunk, spending so much money, it's so much joy. And outside there's this homeless man who can see this through the window, who's starving on the street and freezing. That makes it so much worse. And you couldn't have that great evil, that comparative evil, if we didn't have this great good of luxury and pleasure. And also, in order for human beings to freely commit evil, like the Holocaust, this evil God has to allow them to, freely choose to love each other as well, because otherwise it wouldn't be so truly evil when they choose to commit evil against each other. So in other words, there are these theodicies which reconcile the existence of good with the existence of the evil God. Right, so I can say, yeah, there are loads of reasons why an evil God would allow so much good. And yet the theist usually says, but come on, man, are you really telling me that if there was a maximally evil God, this is what the universe would look like? Like, he couldn't make it any more evil. It just seems, as you say, preposterous. And the point is that similarly, the atheist is going to say, okay, you've got all these theodicies to try to reconcile evil with the existence of a good God, but come on, man, do you really think that if there existed a good God, this is what the universe would look like? So I think it's powerful, but I do think it kind of is just like a support for the problem of evil. You need to assume that the theist is going to reject the existence of an evil God based on the amount of good in the universe, and you're going to have to probably fall back on the analogy that brings up with disproving the good God through evil. So I think it's kind of a version of the problem of evil. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not so sure because I mean, like, suppose that like basically pretty much any plausible argument that one might raise for God's existence would equally support the evil God hypothesis. I mean, if that's the case, then it's starting to look like one may not have good reason to think that God exists as opposed to the evil God. And so, like, the evil God challenge may still indeed have some foothold, even if we think that the problem of good, let's say, is like not a successful argument, or even if we think that it's like a version of the problem of evil. Like, I still think, I don't know, I still find that there's some sort of remnant of a challenge here because, like, it's still a challenge to explain why a good God is more likely than an evil God in light of the seeming parity and support for them, as well as the seeming parity in objections to them. So, like, again, even if it's, I don't know, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of what exact challenge it poses to say, well, there could be an evil God. I mean, for a start, if there is an evil God, that's not atheism, right? Like,
right.
You
So, I mean, the challenge. I mean, the challenge is
to reject the evil God.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is roughly, it could be most clearly stated as follows. The evil God hypothesis and the good God hypothesis are roughly equally plausible. The evil God hypothesis is incredibly implausible, and so the good God hypothesis is incredibly implausible. And we can put this in terms of probability. Like, they have a roughly the same probability because roughly the same supports can be given for them, roughly the same objections apply to them, but the probability of an evil God is incredibly low. And so since they have roughly equal probability, it follows that the probability of a good God is also incredibly low. And so then it follows that the probability of atheism, as construed as denying the existence of a good God, is incredibly high. So that would be the challenge.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But then why would somebody say that the probability of the evil God is really low? Why would they say that?
Ah, right. Well, one thing they might say is just like, listen, it just seems ludicrous. I mean, in the same way that we think, like, you tell me that you can make a four-sided triangle or whatever, and I that seems ludicrous. Like, no, and I assign a very low probability to that because it just seems obviously false. No, you can't. And similarly, if it just seems obviously false that there's no evil God, well, then it seems like we can justifiably assign a low probability to it. So that's one thing we might say. Of course, it's not like a contradiction in terms or something like that. It's not like analytically. It's not like an analytic matter.
Actually, some people would say it is, and maybe that's a worthwhile objection to raise here. Is that some people think that, like, God and good are like the same thing. You know, the Thomists will say that goodness and godness and being, they're all just like one big sort of spherical thing that just like exists. I don't know why I always picture it as a sphere. It's like this divine simplicity, this super simple object. Or maybe there is something about, maybe like if moral realism is true, then if God is omniscient, then he must be omnibenevolent as well, because he would know all moral truths, and maybe moral truths are intrinsically motivating. You know, maybe they're not, whatever. But like, there are people who will make arguments of that kind, who will say, well, if there is any kind of God that is like all powerful and all knowing, it like will follow that God is maximally good, just like by definition, in which case the evil God challenge is undermined because the evil God is not as plausible as the good God. In fact, the evil God is impossible.
Right. So a few things to say here.
As ever.
One thing is that, I mean, listen, if someone just thinks that it's like an analytic matter, that like what it is to be God or to be a God is to be, you know, like goodness itself or something like that. I mean, like, okay, let's not call it the evil God challenge. Let's just call it like the foundational being, which is maximally evil and also knows, you know, is omniscient and omnipotent. Let's just call it like a super demon, okay? I'm not going to call it a god, okay? Because maybe what you mean by God is just something which is goodness itself or something. Okay, I'll call it a super demon, and we'll just call it the super demon challenge. And the argument would then be like, the considerations that are mounted on behalf of the existence of a good God, or just God simpliciter, are equally going to be carrying over, at least roughly, to the existence of this super demon. And the objections to the super demon hypothesis seem to carry over roughly equally plausibly to the existence of to the hypothesis that there's a God. So like, I don't know, like, I don't think it can be so easily swept away just by appealing to like these alleged analytic truths about God being connected to goodness, or like the term God being connected to goodness, or something like that, or just what one means by God. Now, you did bring up this point. It's very similar to something that Swinburne argues. The kind of like, well, this being, the evil God, or the super, I'm going to go forward and say evil God instead of super demon or whatever. The evil God is, according to the hypothesis, omniscient, and so it's going to know all moral truths. And if we think that moral truths are kind of intrinsically motivating, such that merely by knowing them, you are thereby motivated to act in accordance with them, then it's just going to follow that this being is going to have to be motivated to act in accordance with goodness. Any omniscient being is going to have to be omnibenevolent. So I think there are two things to say in response to this. Motivational internalism, what this view is called motivational internalism, that just like morality is kind of inherently motivating, or our knowledge of moral truths, that's kind of inherently motivating. That's just false. I mean, like, the vast majority of philosophers reject it, and it doesn't seem particularly plausible. Very often we know that something is what we really should be doing, and it's the good thing to do. But alas, we're not motivated to do it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are some defenses. I'm sort of quite attracted to the idea of moral truths being intrinsically motivated. I wasn't sure if we were going to sort of get into this. Maybe we shouldn't spend too long on it. But it's worth considering that people want to trivially say, like, well, yeah, but you can believe something's moral and not be motivated to do it. I don't know if you can believe something to be moral and literally not be motivated at all. I mean, you could be motivated in another direction by other things, but it's not like there's no motivation whatsoever there. It might be like you think it's good to give to charity, but you really want that new computer, and so you're not motivated enough to give to charity, but you're still like semi-motivated. It's just overcome by something else. And like, maybe if you knew the truth about the ethics of, like, how much money you ought to be spending on personal computers and stuff, well, whatever the right answer is what you'd end up being motivated to do, right? It's just that there are like competing motivations, and that's why you're not always motivated to do the right thing exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple things to say here. One is that we should distinguish the mere I think it is a descriptive fact that, like, typically speaking, when someone judges something to be morally good, or judges it to be the case that they morally ought to do it, very often they are also motivated to do it. I agree with that. But like, what we're considering here is whether, like, the mere fact that someone judges something like to be good, or judges it to be morally obligatory, the mere fact like entails that they're all going to be motivated to it. Because this argument is like requiring the knowledge to entail that they're going to be motivated. And I don't see why. Like, I don't know. It seems like I can conceive of someone who just like they judge that, yeah, like, this is what I morally should do. But I truly do not care about morality. Like, like a like a psychopath or something. Like, I don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer. He said at some level he knew what he was doing was evil, but maybe it seems to me easily conceivable that he nevertheless could have just been totally felt cold to that. Like, there's no motivation whatsoever to act in accordance with what he knew deep down was kind of evil.
I don't know. Like, when he says something like, I knew somewhere in me that something I was doing is wrong, that says to me that there was something sort of nagging at him, right? Like, I think, in other words, to know a moral truth. I mean, look, you're speaking to an emotivist, so of course I'm going to think that when you say something is wrong, you're obviously going to have like necessarily an emotional reaction to it of some degree. Like, obviously I'm going to think that, but like, I don't know what it can mean to know a moral truth, or become, let's say, convinced of a moral truth, if it doesn't mean to suddenly feel its persuasive power. I think that's what it means to think that, like, in the same way that if you become convinced of an argument, you just suddenly become convinced of the persuasive power of the conclusion. And what does it mean to become convinced of the persuasive power of a moral truth? I think it must mean something like to be like motivated to like it, to act in accordance with it, motivated to want it. So, something like that. That has to be in there somewhere. I can't imagine somebody. Like, you could say, some people say, well, I know it's wrong, but what they mean is they've been told it's wrong, they've been taught it's wrong, but they don't really feel it. They're like, well, I know it's supposed to be wrong for me to, have sex with a man, but I don't know, like, whatever, I'm gay, like, cool. Like they might sort of think something like that, but that's not the same thing as like actually thinking it's wrong and being like, well, I know this is wrong. I know, like I'm convinced that this is wrong. Like I literally believe that it's wrong, and yet that has absolutely no bearing, like none whatsoever, on like my motivation to do it. You know what I mean? It just seems implausible to me.
Right. I mean, again, as a descriptive thesis, I think like the ordinary person, it is going to be implausible if you told me that, like, just pick a person at random and tell me that they really do believe that something is wrong or obligatory, then I'm going to infer that, yeah, it's very, very likely that they're going to have some sort of motivation to either avoid it or to do it. But I don't know. I think we're just maybe not going to see eye to eye on whether or not there's like an entailment
imagine like an extreme case here. Imagine like an extreme case. Imagine somebody is like, I honestly think that stealing is like morally the worst thing you can do. Like worse than murder, worse than anything. The very worst thing you can do to a person is stealing. And they, maybe they tell you why, maybe they give you an argument, whatever. Even if they're irrational, they just claim to be convinced of the truth that is the worst thing you can do to a person. And yet you watch them go and steal from someone, and you say, "Well, hold on a second, mate. Like you said it's like that," and they're like, "Yeah, it doesn't mean I'm in any way, shape, or form motivated to it." And then further, imagine that they then like refused to throw their cigarette butt on the floor because they thought it was immoral. And you said, "Hold on a sec. Oh, wait. What do you mean?" They're like, "Yeah, I think it's probably kind of wrong to throw a cigarette butt on the floor." And you're like, "Okay, so you think that it's kind of wrong to throw a cigarette butt on the floor, and you think it's like the worst thing in the world to steal, and yet you're not motivated not to steal, but you are motivated to pick up the cigarette." It would seem like something's just like, it would seem like that kind of person like kind of can't exist. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I think the way that you're describing the scenario is kind of like biasing our intuitions, because the way that you're describing it is like this person is like telling you, like, this is the worst thing in the world. They're passionate about it. You're envisioning them saying this, like, yeah, I mean, clearly then they do indeed care about this. They have motivation to act in accordance with it. But like, once you describe the situation in a different sort of way, this person just does not care at all about morality. They have moral beliefs, like they think certain things are morally better and morally worse, but all they care about is their prudential self-interest, and that's all that they're motivated by. They just don't give a crap about morality, even though they have various moral beliefs. And I don't know, to me, that seems at least conceivable. I don't know. But we may not see eye to eye on this point, but this is bringing me to my next point, and it's that even if like these moral facts, knowledge of these moral facts is kind of intrinsically motivating, I don't know, the evil god might have stronger desires to do what's in contrary to the what they know to be morally wrong or whatever. They may nevertheless have even stronger desires that oppose that. And so it's not going to follow that something is omnibenevolent from the fact that it knows and even is motivated by its knowledge of all the moral truths. Because again, it may have countervailing psychological weights, as it were, countervailing desires that push it even more strongly against their other motivations to do what's morally right and wrong. And those may always win out, such that this being behaves maximally terribly. So I don't know. I don't think there's an entailment relation there. I mean,
sure. I kind of forgot that we were talking about the evil god challenge, to be honest with you.
Yes, right. That's why I'm trying to bring it back around. So I don't know. I don't find, like, even if we granted motivational internalism, it wouldn't actually follow that omniscience and omnipotence or omniscience alone entails omnibenevolence, because there may very well be countervailing desires that make the being behave in terrible ways. Now, one thing that one could note at this juncture is that, well, at least so long as you have motivational internalism and we don't posit the existence of additional desires, then we get omnibenevolence, right? So then the theistic hypothesis doesn't have to like posit additional desires. It just takes on motivational internalism, right? And you get omnibenevolence from omniscience alone. Whereas the evil god hypothesis has omniscience, and if we really do think motivational internalism is true, well then in order to avoid the omnibenevolence consequence, and in order to make the evil god hypothesis even consistent, they have to posit very strong desires that counteract the relevant motivations. And so, at least in one respect, the evil God hypothesis is less simple than the theistic hypothesis, provided, again, that we accept motivational internalism, because they're positing the evil God hypothesis has to posit these additional desires that the theist does not have to posit. And so there's a discrepancy in the simplicity hypotheses, and if we think a simpler theory is other things being equal more probable than one that is less simple, then there's actually some sort of asymmetry between the hypotheses.
So, having said all of that, where does it go?
Okay, well, let me make one more point, which is one of the reasons why I this will justify my lower placement than one might otherwise think.
Okay.
So I actually do think that there are a number of asymmetries between these hypotheses. I mean, one is that it seems like the good God hypothesis is more internally coherent. It meshes well. Its various parts mesh better together than the evil God hypothesis. So what do I mean by that? Well, suppose I have an urn, right? It's this big container, and it's got a bunch of balls in there, okay? And I go in there, I pick out a ball, and it's black. Okay, I put it down. Go in there, and I'm just randomly doing this. I'm not looking. Take another one, it's black. Go down and take another one, it's black. Take another one, it's black. Okay, at some point, like, I'm getting, like, I've gotten 8 black balls. I'm going to form a hypothesis about what I'm going to get next. And indeed, my observations so far give me good reason to think that the next one that I pick, the next ball that I pick, is going to be black. This is just kind of standard inductive reasoning. The fact that all the 8 balls that I've chosen so far are black gives me good reason to think that the other ball is going to be black. And if you have a hypothesis, and your hypothesis is that, despite the fact that all these other ones were black, the next one's going to be white, your hypothesis is, at least other things being equal, worse than mine. Mine is more probable. Mine is better supported by the other internal aspects of my hypothesis, that all the ones that were already taken were black. Whereas you think all the other ones that were already taken were black, but the next one's going to be white. So my hypothesis is better. It's more its various parts mesh better together with one another. Okay, how does that relate to the evil God challenge? Well, when we compare the hypotheses of the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis, and we look at the good God hypothesis, like each of God's properties that the good God is characterized as having seem to be perfections. They seem to be great-making features, like omniscience. Wow, what an awesome thing to have. How valuable it is to have all this kind of knowledge. Omnipotence. Oh my goodness, the ability to do anything. That's a great-making feature. It's a perfection. Oh my goodness, necessary existence. It has a kind of robust grip on reality. It's not like it just happens to exist. Oh my goodness, it's independent. So it's not like deriving its existence from another. It's not dependent. So it seems to be great in all these various ways. And the good God hypothesis says, yeah, it's got all great making features. So there's a kind of uniformity there. Just like all the balls, and like me saying that all of these 8 balls together with the next one, they're all black. The good God hypothesis says, yeah, all of God's features are great making features. But this is where we come to the evil God hypothesis. And that's actually like your hypothesis that, despite the fact that all the 8 ones that I drew were black, the next one's going to be white. So you look at the evil God hypothesis and you start looking at its features. Oh my goodness, it's got like necessary existence. Oh my goodness, what a great feature. It's got a great grip on reality. That seems to be like a perfection. It seems to make a being better. Oh my goodness, it's got omniscience. What a great making feature, It seems to be a perfection because it's got all this knowledge, and knowledge is valuable. Oh my goodness, it's omnipotent. It's got another great making feature. But then suddenly we come across another feature, and it's suddenly a terrible feature. Namely, the feature of being like maximally evil or whatever. And so you can see how there's a kind of the elements of this hypothesis don't mesh well together, because the very fact that this being has all these other perfections gives us good reason to think that it has all perfections. It gives us inductive reason to think that it has all perfections. But so then, if you have a hypothesis that, no, it's got all the perfections but one, and that one's a terrible making feature, then your hypothesis, it just doesn't mesh well with its various parts together. And it's going to be less probable than the good God hypothesis because of that. So anyway, that's one of the
I think
reasons.
That's interesting. It does sort of, maybe we're like importing moral or at least value judgments into things like omniscience and omnipotence to say they're great making. Sort of, we want to say something like, they're kind of like good things to have, which I don't know if we can like assume that. Like maybe there's just sort of like more of it, like being more powerful, like more knowledgeable. And when it comes to morality, unless you think evil is just a privation of good, it's not obvious to me that like you can't just have more evil, more good. Like it's kind of hard to say, but at the same time, on an intuitive level, I understand what you're saying. Like these things seem like good, and they seem like the kind of being we're describing, omnipotent, omniscient, has these qualities that we sort of think, yeah, they're like uppers, not downers. Having said that, like I don't know if it could be any other way, because I like the mirror image of this would be like a a maximally unpowerful, maximally ignorant, and yet perfectly good being, which kind of wouldn't make any sense. Like, that definitely doesn't make any sense. But then, so would like a sort of maximally unknowledgeable, maximally impotent, and also maximally evil god. It sort of doesn't really make sense either. Like, I don't know, it's kind of weird to think about, like, the sort of great making properties of omnipotence and omniscience seem to only move in one direction in terms of them having like more of it, whereas morality seems to stretch off in two directions. So I'm not sure. I think that requires a bit more investigation, but I understand what you're saying, and at least understand why that would give it a bit more sort of like force in terms of its ability to actually convince people. So,
well, yeah, and also, I mean, just one final thing before we rank it. Like, one might say in response to this kind of coherence-based reasoning that I gave, one might think that maybe like whether those other features that I mentioned, like omnipotence and omniscience and so on, and necessary existence, whether those features are actually great making or whether they're good, actually depends kind of holistically on what the being is like overall. And if the being has, for instance, unlimited or infinite or maximal evil, well, then those other features actually don't contribute to its greatness. Instead, they make it worse, right? If there's a necessary being which is maximally evil, well, it'd be better if it exists in just one, if it exists in just one world. But if it exists in literally all possible worlds, that seems to be worse, because again, given that it's unlimited or infinite or maximal in evil, its necessary existence makes it worse. Similarly, its knowledge, now it knows exactly how to implement all of its terrible plans. And similarly with omnipotence, now it's able to implement all of its terrible plans. So you might think that these actually aren't sort of like, these features aren't in and of themselves great making. Whether or not they're great making actually may depend on the moral character of the being in question. So actually, maybe this hypothesis has a great deal of internal coherence, because these are actually they're all terrible making features, given that it has unlimited, infinite, maximal evil or whatever. So
yeah, interesting. Okay, so once again, we've got to actually place this on the board. So
right.
What do you think, man? I mean, let's think what we've got so far. Is it better than The Universe is Big?
I think so, yeah.
Probably. Is it better than Religious Confusion?
No.
I would say probably not, which means that unless you think it's sort of on a par with either of those, we've got it in C tier right now.
I think that's fair. I mean, there are other asymmetries between the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis that we can't get into. Again, like the literature on this is very vast, so I just want to alert the audience that we haven't covered all the potential asymmetries.
Sure.
But yeah, I think C tier is fair. I mean, it's not like it's a knockdown argument, but it's also not like it's like silly. Like professional philosophers take this very seriously.
So we've got this now. We've got every tier covered except for F, which is kind of nice. Maybe some people think there's an atheistic bias going on. I would wholeheartedly reject the charge, but then I wouldn't I?